and introduce myself to the students who are here. My name is Lennox Honychurch, born in Dominica. Basically worked and remained here for all my life, except for the 4 to 5 years when I was in Britain at the University of Oxford, fulfilling a scholarship and doing my MA and DPhil in anthropology. And then I returned to Dominica and continued to work there. I have also participated in politics. I was a member of the House of Assembly and also participated in the establishment of the Dominica Freedom Party under the direction of the political leader, Mary Eugenia Charles, who was the first woman in the Caribbean to become a prime minister. By pure chance, my grandmother was the first woman in the Caribbean to be elected to Parliament. So as has been mentioned by speakers earlier on, there is a great prevalence of women in positions of political and commercial power in Dominica for a number of reasons. My main production has been the Dominica Story, which is a book that I produced the first edition was in 1975. And it has gone through a number of editions since. This is the latest one. I know that when you are projecting on this, they're always back to front, but this is the book which essentially begins with the volcanic formation of Dominica, because we're using, in essence, my presentation here is using the island of Dominica as an example for Caribbean social, political, and environmental change as a whole. We could talk about Jamaica, we could talk about Trinidad. A number of them have the same pattern of change, but of course it all depends on size, it depends on the geological formation. So you will have islands like Barbados that are coral islands, very flat. And when the initial set of English settlers arrived in 1627, there were no indigenous people to contend with, which is very different from many other parts of the Caribbean. And the flatness of the island meant that colonization was speedy, swift, and thorough. And from an environmental point of view, the forest was decimated and cut off within a very short space of time. So you compare that to a place like Dominica or St. Vincent or St. Lucia, which are part of the inner volcanic chain of the islands and therefore are extremely mountainous, and even up to today have in the center backbone of each island areas that are almost hardly ever visited. And are impossible to reside in because of the nature and the volcanic geology of the place. So you've also got changes in which colonizer took over the island. The languages shift from one island to the next. Dominica sits between Martinique and Guadeloupe. Martinique and Guadeloupe are one of the earliest French colonies in the Caribbean, and they are thoroughly French, and more so that they are departments of France. They're called Département Outre-mer, the overseas departments of France. They vote for members in the French Parliament. They are totally part of France, in spite of being over 4,000 miles away. And that's very different from the English islands, most of which became independent in the late 20th century, from 1962 in the case of Jamaica and also Trinidad, and then going through the 70s and into the 80s with all the other islands. But then you had very small islands that really could not go it on their own. Islands like Montserrat. And so you have some 5, what some people call the little pink bits, the leftover pieces of empire that were not able to be um, made independent. And therefore you have Anguilla, Montserrat, the Cayman Islands further out into the mid-Caribbean, up into the Atlantic, you have Bermuda. And essentially these are uh, self-governing with their small councils, but ultimately they are linked to the Foreign Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Office in England. And governors are sent out from England, or sometimes temporarily, governors are appointed, local governors are appointed to take care of business, but on behalf of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in England. So you still have those island territories. The British Virgin Islands is another one I should mention, and they are still there. Thank you very much. We've got a map right in front of us here, and there is Dominica. You can see Montserrat and St. Lucia, Barbados, all part of this chain from the Orinoco region of South America, from Trinidad, going up until you reach the British Virgin Islands, and after that, you're in the Greater Antilles. The Greater Antilles, of course, because those islands are much larger. You have Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, which is shared between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Cuba. All the other islands, smaller islands I mentioned, like the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, which are also the overseas departments, if you will, of Britain. They're British Overseas Territories is the correct term. And then you have the Bahamas that are independent. So the Greater Antilles have a rather different social pattern than the smaller islands to the southeast. And then, of course, you've got islands like Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire, which are down along the coast of South America, and they are Dutch. So you see the Caribbean that Britain knows about and British people hear about are very much a question of being British and all of the British links. But we forget that the Caribbean is really a very multifaceted place with very many national influences in response to the type of colonization that took place. I see that further down there is a slide you've got of Dominica between Martinique and Guadeloupe. And that would be good to put on. Well, there's Dominica here. There's Dominica between Martinique and Guadeloupe. Two large and powerful, very much more highly populated territories than Dominica. There is a boundary in the sea between these territories, but there tends to be a great deal of cooperation because, of course, the islands are so close. And Dominica had a lot of French influence during its history and was occupied by France for quite a long time, particularly at the beginning. And in fact, in spite of the fact of being a British colony and being occupied by British personnel, the majority of Europeans sometimes were actually French, and they made an accommodation with the British that they could remain. And so you have north of us, the islands of Marie-Galante, the Saints, of Guadeloupe, the main island of Guadeloupe, Basse-Terre and Grand-Terre. And then south across the channel, there you can see Grand Bay that Professor Del Sol was talking about. That faces directly onto Martinique. And there's a lot of movement, and always has been, between Martinique, the north coast of Martinique, and the south coast of Dominica. And similarly, between the north coast of Dominica and the French islands. For instance, I am in my little office in my house in the north of Dominica, but if I walked out onto the veranda, there in front of me would be the French islands. So we're very close indeed, but culturally very different because of the different trajectory that has been taken in the post-colonial period. The other book that I have done, among from many others, and I will show it here, is before I get into the map of Dominica, is in the Forests of Freedom. Once again, I think it's back to front, but this is the British edition, and then this is the U.S. edition published by the University of Puerto Rico. I'm sorry, of Mississippi. The University of Mississippi is in the American version.
Sorry, you've just muted, Professor. You're on mute. If you can unmute Dr. Lennox. I've just shared a little Amazon page of your publications. There you go.
So yes, these are some of the books. We have the, don't know whether you're seeing them, the Caribbean People Book 1, which deals with the islands and the indigenous people. Caribbean People Book 2, well, you can see it up on the screen there as well. Caribbean People Book 2, which is the colonial arrivals, the whole period of slavery, the operation of plantations and all of that. And then Book 3, which actually takes you into the end of the 20th century. And they're popping up all over the place, but I essentially have concentrated mainly on social history and political history, the way in which society and politics have changed the island. In the set of slides that you have online there, I did see also a map of Dominica, which may be useful. There we have it. Dominica is a volcanic island. Its origins are some 12 million years old. It is like all the other islands of the Lesser Antilles. It has a backbone of central mountains, and they run down the back of the island and lead off into various ridges, ravines, and valleys. This has created a very mountainous island, and this is one of the challenges, not only today, but in the past. In one way, it was very protective for the sake of the indigenous people, because it allowed them to have this retreat from the other islands which were being taken bit by bit after the arrival of Christopher Columbus and his 4 voyages on behalf of the Spanish crown. Remember, he was an Italian, but he was sailing on behalf of Spain and occupying these islands. He named the island Dies Dominica because it was a Sunday, and in Latin, that's the day of our Lord. So he did not land because the East Coast is very rough and rugged, and therefore extremely difficult to, if not impossible, to land. And so he continued on to the neighboring island of Marigalante, which he named after his flagship, the Maria Galante. And then he had prayed in the monastery of Santa Maria de la Guadalupe in Cadiz before he had left Spain. And so in honor of that, he named the next island Guadeloupe. And the day before, they had celebrated the Feast of All Saints. And so he called a little group of islands that he next saw Todos los Santos, and they're known as Les Saints still today. Now, as he moved north, this is the pattern that he took. So that's why we have Antigua, Santa Maria de la Antigua, Montserrat, for a monastery that where he had stayed and helped him out and gave him sustenance. And so all up the islands, he gave like the the Virgin Islands, for instance, he gave the names for St. Ursula, and because there were so many islands, he thought he'd call them Virgin Islands after the thousand virgins. Anyway, they moved on Puerto Rico and then into Hispaniola. And so only a few of the larger islands or parts of islands maintained their indigenous names. Like Jamaica became Jamaica, and you have Cuba and Haiti, which was the original name for the island of Hispaniola. Then it took the indigenous name after it became independent in 1804. So you have a mix of languages. You have going back to the indigenous, right up to the post-colonial period when countries were going independent, as in the case of the Dominican Republic, which was called Santo Domingo, and in 1844 became the República Dominicana. So these are all the different changes that have taken place. But if we go back to the map of Dominica, I can talk a little bit about this as well in relation to its colonization. Because it was so mountainous, because it was this retreat for the indigenous people, it remained uncolonized longer than anywhere else. It really was not until the Treaty of Paris in 1763 that Dominica became colonized by agreement between the French and the British. In 1660, the English and the French got together with the Kalinago indigenous Carib people, as they had been called before, and agreed on a treaty, the Treaty of Basse-Terre in St. Kitts, in 1660, which would leave Dominica and St. Vincent to the indigenous people in perpetuity, forever. That was the ideal. But here and there, both African escapees came into the island, and then you had white refugees, if you will, deserters from some of the plantations, because we must remember it's not a part of Caribbean history that is told very much, but the early settlement of particularly the English and French islands was the labor force came from indentured labor. We call them in France engagés. They were engaged. Engagés or white indentured labor. In the case of Britain, these arrived at different times. There were people from particularly the West Country, Devon and these places, who came, signed themselves on with the promise that they would get some land, and this is after 5 to 7 years of work. Then there were others who were prisoners of war, particularly during the Cromwellian era. When Cromwell took over, for instance, and attacked and took over Ireland, he sent a lot of Irish prisoners, political prisoners, to work in the fields in places like Barbados and Antigua and St. Kitts and stuff. Now, many of them escaped and then came to places like Dominica. So it was a peculiar mix that was developing. And the other big period of exportation of English prisoners of war was during the Monmouth Rebellion. That was the child of Charles II, who raised a rebellion to try to get the crown, and that was defeated. And many of those people, you know the story of Judge Jeffreys, the bloody assizes. Many of those people who were found guilty of opposing the king, they were packed off to Barbados. They were the Monmouth rebels, and they were put to work along as prisoners of war with the indentured people. So you found a lot of those people emigrated, escaped however they could to places like Dominica, because it was a kind of refuge. And then you had the Africans who were also escaping from the plantations on the neighboring islands, even as far as Puerto Rico. And then you had the indigenous people. And the indigenous people, of course, they had been there, um, various groups of them, from well before the Christian era. We date the first arrival from what would be 3000 BC. These are hunter-gatherer people. But around the time of the Christian era, we have people who arrived from South America, from the region of the Orinoco River, and they came up to the islands, and they were agriculturalists, and they also made pottery and built houses and planted horticulture, planted farms. I have here, for instance, some artifacts from the early people. Here you have a stone tool, which would be attached to a piece of wood and strapped in. Stone axe found on the west coast of Dominica. Here is another one. Volcanic, the hardest volcanic rock possible, and you find these all over the island, you know. But those were before Columbus. And one of the big things that really linked them to the European arrivals was that they could trade with people like Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins and these people who ended up coming to Dominica for axes. So you'd have an iron axe from England or a cutlass or even scissors. These were very attractive because they would replace the stone tools which took so long to make. And then pre-Columbian people also had these made pottery. So I have, for instance, this is what is called an adorno, and that would be a part of a bowl that you would be able to pick up the bowl, but it would also be a representative. In this case, it's believed to be a pelican that is represented here. And here is from Martinique, a beautiful, beautiful clay bowl. And of course, all the incisions here are mythical and spiritual representation. So some of these, we do archaeology around the island. We found some 70 sites, and this gives us an idea of the really interesting, complex society that existed in these islands before the arrival of the Europeans. It would be the same for people in the Pacific. If you learn about the early cultures in Polynesia, it really is very similar to the early cultures of the Caribbean, except, of course, our islands are much closer together. You can see one island from the other, whereas in the Pacific, in Polynesia, they had these amazing trips lasting thousands of miles in which they populated the islands of the Pacific. So let us understand that Columbus arrives 1493. It's his second voyage. He names all of these islands after either religious, for religious sources, or for places in Spain like Hispaniola. He calls his first settlement Isabella, after the Queen of Spain, who has been so helpful to get him across and to finance his voyages and stuff like this. So that's the beginning. And then as colonization begins, you have these various groups with their different cultures arriving. The first recorded arrival of a ship with Africans directly from what was then called the Guinea coast was in 1518 into Cuba. They did arrive earlier on because many of them had been brought up to the Iberian Peninsula, to Portugal and Spain, and then were transshipped in small numbers across the Atlantic. But it is not until sugar arrives and sort of takes over production in the Caribbean that you get the huge surge of African arrivals, because those earlier crops, particularly tobacco, cotton, and smaller spice crops and others, they were the crops that were mainly cultivated by those white indentured labor that came out from Europe, whether the French, the engagés, or the English, mainly from the, as I said, the West Country, or Irish and Scottish as well. Anybody who was could be transported and be useful for labor in the colonies, they were taken. But the thing was, the change to sugar. The change to sugar really revolutionized everything, because the labor that was required and the intensity of that labor was so big, so powerful, that they then turned to Africa for that amount of labor. And so it became embedded in the Caribbean society, mainly from the 1630s, 1640s. You found those companies being formed, the Royal African Company and others in England. And we'll talk about England focus, but of course we had the Dutch and the Portuguese, who had originally established connections with chiefs in West Africa, and began the trade there, because we're dealing with an island that is essentially English. We will say British after 1700, 1705, but for most of the 17th century, it was described as English colonies. The French were also coming in, and so were the Dutch. So all of these in the Lesser Antilles were contesting with each other for these islands. And as I mentioned earlier, with the treaty from 1660, where these two islands, St. Vincent and Dominica, were going to be left in perpetuity for the indigenous people, how different they would be if that had been maintained. But the thing was that by the middle of the 18th century, in the 1700s, there was intense rivalry among the islands because of the value of sugar. Sugar was such a major income earner for the maritime states of Europe, particularly Britain and France, that the competition was very intense. Everybody wanted a sugar island. And that is when, in the 1760s, during the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, that there was this determination to capture islands and turn them into plantations. And that's what they did in the case of Dominica. In the Treaty of Paris, 1763, Dominica was handed to Britain, as was St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago. And these islands were created as a single colony called the Southern Caribbean Isles. But very soon they broke up individually, and Dominica got its own government, and the pattern of government followed exactly as the others. You had an imitation of the British Parliament. So you had your voters, only white males could vote for membership of the House of Assembly. And then the governor, who was sent out from England, he would then appoint an executive council So just imagine that you are imitating on a small scale. The House of Commons is a House of Assembly. The Executive Council, as it was called, is the House of Lords. And then the governor sent out from England is representing the crown. So he's like the king, he's like the monarch. And the governors had great power because remember, you're talking about sailing ships, taking time to cross the Atlantic, instructions coming from England and then being replied to would take months. And so the governor had to act on his own deliberate judgment very, very often. And so those governors had great power indeed. And the whole point of the exercise was to suck out as much money as possible from the colonies. So there were the essentials that had to be invested in, like the sugar plantations, all of the machinery to go with it, the windmills, the water mills, and all of that. The purchase of enslaved people, that was also part of the investment. The maintaining of those enslaved people with food and clothing as tight and as cheap as possible, so that the profits could be squeezed out for the mainly absentee owners in England. So what you found is that certain people would come out, begin settlement, establish their plantations, but as the plantation got to be working efficiently, they would go back to England, which it was more comfortable. In their mind, it was more healthy. They were free from all of the tropical diseases and stuff. And then they would be able to live in comfort in England by just using the money that was sent back to them or that was actually sold right there in London when the sugar arrived. So these absentee owners then also became members of the British Parliament because they were in Britain and they could have their constituencies and take seats in Parliament. And so they wielded a great deal of power up in England as well. And then they had their managers and their so-called attorneys who would be responsible for the plantations down the islands. And the slave trade was then intensifying, the numbers were increasing. You had new colonies like Dominica, Tobago, and St. Vincent. Some of them, like Dominica, were made free ports. So although we have records that 100,000 enslaved Africans arrived in Dominica, not all of them remained because the place was a free port. So people could come from as far as South Carolina and Boston and anywhere on the eastern seaboard of the 13 colonies, buy enslaved people and then take them back, or they would shift them to other parts of the Caribbean. Sugar product, they sent out immediately also surveyors. 2 years after the Treaty of Paris, surveyors arrived in Dominica and St. Vincent and Tobago and began chopping up the land into lots for sale. And these huge maps, they still exist. They were produced in Britain, and then they were each given a number. And I had here a directory with all the names and who the purchasers were to be able to everybody wanted a piece of the action. You know, it was like oil. New investments were pouring in. And so the whole pattern of slave society developed with your governor and the senior people up above, and then a sort of pyramid going down with the free people of color. Then for instance, just to use an example here, I realized that I could use the illustrations in these textbooks for some of what I'm talking about, because I don't have the slides.
I have a slide on the screen, which is a digital map of addresses of where the the
I'm
invest
here. I'm here.
the investors lived. It's put together by the UCL, University College London, and they managed to trace all the slave owners throughout Britain who owned a piece of an estate in the Caribbean. So these little maps are examples of what you just talked about. They live in England, and their offshore investments are happening in back in the Caribbean. If we click on Leeds, for example, here's some people who own some slaves
Y-
in the
I'm
in the
hearing.
Caribbean.
I'm hearing Blaine
Correct.
talking, but
Correct.
I'm not
Yeah.
hearing exactly what he's saying. So,
Oh, okay. Okay, back to you.
but
Thank you.
anyway, this is the sort of pyramid that we're seeing developing in the islands. You've got your governor and ruling people up on top. Then you've got your poor whites, that is those indentured labor. And then you had a color bar. And below that color bar, you had your freed people of color. And I'll be talking a little bit about that in a while. Then you had your domestic enslaved people, that is, people who were working very close to the masters in the houses, the cooks, the butlers, the people responsible for uh, uh, of, of, of the carts and all that skilled labor. And then you had the field slaves down at the bottom. So this was the society that basically developed in the islands. Um, and that was in place. I want to talk a bit about the free people of color, because this is a very important component in the whole thing. In the case of Dominica having developed very late, by that time, Caribbean society had shifted into all kinds of new cultural patterns. And there were many free people of color, people who, by one means or another, had become free. Either they had bought their own freedom by saving up money from the marketplaces over a long period of time, or they would be rewarded for basically uh, revealing the presence of plots to overthrow the plantations, or they had killed chiefs or among the Maroons who were in the hills. By one means or another, they would get freedom. And once they had got their freedom, they were entitled to buy land and not to be members of parliament or anything, but essentially to engage in commerce and to build themselves up. And so there was this group, the free people of color, who were given freedom for one means or another, gained it in different ways. And as has been pointed out, in the case of Dominica, many of them came across from the French islands and purchased land, and they in turn became slave holders. So Dominica had the largest number of people of color who were slave holders. Now, for an island boy like me, it becomes very difficult to keep track of how in England these terms are used. Now, in Dominica, we are very frank and open with these things. You say, oh, those black people, or the person, a colored person, or you'll even hear older people talk about mulattoes because they're mixed or light skinned. In Jamaica, you'll talk about high brown. And these terms are still sort of freely used, or a red-skinned person, you know. Whereas increasingly now, in places like the United States and in England, Britain, it's changing a great deal, and people are very concerned about what kinds of terms they use. Whereas for us in the islands, uh, a lot of these historic terms are still prevalent. And one thing that we note, and I'll get back to, I'm jumping the gun a bit, but it's interesting when we're talking about a changing society, that we in Dominica, we have like everywhere else, the University College London, I think, has been actually putting online all of the counts of the compensation that was granted to slaveholders in the 1830s. Now, in the case of Dominica, there are large numbers of people of color who were slaveholders, and their descendants are still in Dominica. All the grand family names of Dominica are still there. There it is, the Legacies of British Slavery, University College London. And the families still exist. Uh, the slaveholding families that were given compensation in the 1830s in Dominica, they are still exist. Many of them don't even realize that their ancestors inherited this money. Now, in the case of the British landowners, well, they kept their money in England. There is a famous case in England of the Gregg family, the Gregg. They were one of the largest slaveholders in Dominica. And when they got, and all the profits that they made out of Dominica, yeah, here we have just Gilmore, Gregg, James Gregg, John J. Gregg. You have it listed, if that's what you are seeing on your screen. You have it listed there. We have Greggs in Jamaica, but there are also Greggs in Dominica. You see, the families sometimes owned estates on different parts of the island. So these are in Kingston, and you'll see the list which says, okay, they had 2 enslaved, or 7 or 4, or if it's an entire plantation, you're talking about 100 and something enslaved. So the Greggs who were in Dominica, they took their money and they reinvested it in cotton mills in the Midlands in England. And this is what you could do. You take your slave money, your compensation money, and then you would send it to be, yeah, there it is, Hillsborough. If you see, for instance, the awardee, Thomas Gregg, he has the Hillsborough estate, which still exists today, had at that time 319 enslaved people. Well, no, it's 128 enslaved people, and he gets 2,830 pounds, 15 shillings and 9 pence for them. And what they did is they sent a lot of that money up to invest in mills, a mill particularly in the Midlands in England. Or if they were investing, for instance, in the newly opened colonies of New Zealand or Australia, or even in India, Quarry Bank Cotton Mill. I don't know who's doing this, but thank you so much. It's it's showing exactly what I'm talking about.
That's me.
Son of Samuel Gregg, the owner of Quarry Bank Cotton Mill in Manchester. Connections to the London mercantile firm of Thomas Gregg. They're not fully established, but research is underway. I can tell you that Thomas Gregg was occupying Hillsborough Estate in Dominica, gained money, and then it was shared with the firm and the family. And therefore you have this now. I think as John's brother also owned an estate in Dominica. And it just continues, all the links with Britain. Now, what is interesting about Hillsborough Estate is that the Greggs owned it from the very beginning of British colonization of Dominica in 1763, and they owned it all the way up until 1928, when they sold it to a Dominican family called Roll, who were people of color and who then bought the estate from the Greggs. And their family now still own this plantation. So here is a plantation since 1763 that has been only owned by two families, the British family of the Greggs, and then transferring to the Dominica family of the Rolls, who have become, very powerful people in the island. So here as examples that we should learn about, because it basically shows us that things are not as sometimes people visualize it when they're up in England and they hear about all of this, slavery and plantation work, but they don't fully understand how complex it is, and it transcends color, it transcends ethnicity in that regard. So Hillsborough is just one example, but there are many examples all over Dominica, and particularly when you get to places like Tobago and Grenada. But in Dominica, it's interesting because a large number of the people who benefited from slavery, still their descendants are still living in Dominica and are really considered to be Black Dominicans. But their ancestors were slaveholders, It can get
Lennox,
very complicated.
Lennox, as
Yes?
I say, we've got 10 minutes. And I was wondering, it'd be nice if we could have 5 minutes at the end for a bit of a sort of plenary of what we've heard this afternoon. So just saying, 5 minutes odd, if that's okay, please.
So something may be wrong with my speakers or so, because I'm not hearing you very well.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat box. But you got 10 minutes, Lennox, and we're finishing at 4 o'clock. That's the.
I haven't really heard anything at all.
Okay.
And please give me notice of when you'd like me to stop.
Can you hear me, Dr. Lennox? Can you hear Blaine? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? You've got 5 minutes to go, Lennox. 5 minutes left.
Okay, fine.
Thank you. Yeah.
Is that okay, Lennox?
Five more minutes, Lennox. Keep it going. Keep going, sir. 5 more
Well,
minutes to go.
I wasn't sure if you were hearing me, because I'm not hearing anything you're telling me.
Okay. Five more minutes. Keep it going.
You're giving me 5 minutes? 5 minutes more to wrap up. All right? Yeah, fine. Good. Now, what is very interesting is also the fact that on emancipation, there was the initial emancipation of 1834. The legislation was passed in England in 1833. The actual first phase of emancipation was 1st of August 1834, but I prefer to use the full emancipation date of the 1st of August 1838, because those 4 years they still had to work without pay, and they would only get paid an honorarium over time. So essentially, it was slavery continued in a modified form. But from 1838, there was what was called full free, and that is why in the islands, Queen Victoria is associated with emancipation. But she was not on the throne in 1833, 1834. But you hear people talk in the popular history of Queen Victoria granting full freedom, and that she was on the throne just about a year in 1838. But as I put in this book, the book which I talk about, the forests of freedom, I just want to end here because this is the beginning of a completely new era. This is across the British Caribbean. Um, and I'll read it. When the liberated laborers of Dominica pushed open the rough wooden window shutters and doors of their huts to let in sunlight on the new day of the 1st of August, 1838, they possessed nothing. Not even the huts were their own, much less for the land on which they stood. The new Lieutenant Governor of Dominica, John Longley, had made this clear some days before, when he read out the Declaration of Emancipation. He said, and I quote, "Now let me tell you what the law has ordered for you now that you are free men. You may remain in the houses and on the estates where you are until the 1st of October if you wish to do so. But the houses in which you live and the grounds which you have planted are not yours." So essentially, from that day, with nothing, the majority of the Caribbean people had to begin a life creating a new society for themselves. And this essentially lasted for over 100 years. There's all the things like trade unions, forming of trade unions, forming of societies that would help one another. All of these things developed into the 20th century. In the 1930s, there were riots and strikes. And then eventually, the British government felt, look, we have to assist these people. And they assisted with a lot of social services, hospitals, healthcare, ports, roads, and all of these things. And then gradually, self-government was granted and eventually independence. So we've done occupation, we've gone up into slavery, we've reached emancipation, but essentially a new story starts from the 1st of August, 1838. Thank you. I don't know why.
Thank you, Lennox. Thank you so much. Over to you, Alan.
Well, we've got a few minutes, folks. I mean, are there any immediate responses or final questions to ask of Stephen, of Blaine, of Lennox, etc.? Do you want to take your screen off, Blaine? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Cheers.
The feedback coming in on the chat is fantastic. Thank you, Amy Anderton. Emma, thank you. Thank you. Cassie Lund says, thank you, Lennox, for the in-depth history. Very interesting content. Thank you, Lennox. Please keep them coming, folks. Keep them coming. I'm truly indebted to the speakers today. Dr. Lennox Honychurch, Prof. Stephen Delsol, Alan, as we've all collaborated to give content to learners today. And it's so important, learners, that we get feedback from you. I'm going to take a minute or two just to go around the room. What was your takeaway, Emma Farquhar, from what any of the speakers said today? Just give us a takeaway, something that you'll take away from today. Anything? Come on camera, please. Yep.
Yeah. So I was just thinking that it hadn't crossed my mind that freedom would then lead to more hardship, in that you wouldn't have somewhere to live, you'd be jobless. It'd just be it obviously I knew there'd be hardship from that, but just that sort of, and being told that you couldn't live in your home anymore, that didn't belong to you, and that kind of that sounded tough, and just a level of just horror, really.
Yes, more poverty, and coming out of poverty with drive, and a sort of embedded character that Stephen Delsol mentioned earlier on. Amy Kenyon, any feedback? Can you just come on camera and just give us one or two takeaway messages from the contribution today of Dr. Lennox Honychurch, all the way in Dominica, Stephen Delsol? Okay, time's ticking, folks. We really want to optimize. We just really want to optimize with any feedback from the heart, please. Just some feedback. Yes, please come in.
I just think it's really important when in the last module we learnt about cultural humility and cultural competence, how important it is to learn these things and move forward into being occupational therapists to understand clients and people we work with, the people we'll work for, in their history and where they've come from. It will, I think that this sort of learning will help us become much better therapists in the future.
Thank you. Alan, over to you, if that's to help us wrap up with that.
I wanted to put a question to you, Blaine. Let's say you've written the POJ triggers and the module, and I was wondering what would you like us to be open to from what we've heard from Stephen and from Lennox? What because I'm assuming you did have thoughts about why Stephen and why Lennox would be really useful people for the student, for us all to hear. What would you like us to take away?
Well, we're really grateful for their wisdom. This is a lifetime of interrogation of the facts as social scientists, occupational scientists, academic scholars, and we can argue a point, we can advocate, but we must have the evidence. We're no different to lawyers. You know, this is about occupational justice. We'll find the injustices in various forms, and there's nuance. You know, Lennox today has spoken about the nuance. Here's a tragedy, here are events, but let's look at it from another angle, you know, and then again, present the evidence, yeah? Beyond anecdote, folks, get the data. And I'm interested in use of artifact, use of historical document, as well as surveys and interviews. There's other things that we can bring into the evidence gallery, so to speak. Those of you who need to leave now, thank you so much. Lots of respect to you. I'll communicate with you in an announcement. We're just going to remain in the room for 5 minutes to let it marinate, but thank you if you need to leave. So, Alan, is that okay? My response?
Yeah. No, exactly what's needed. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Yeah. Just final recap, Stephen Del Sol. Final recap, please. You're on mute. You're on mute, sir.
I think Alan's question, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
It's absolutely pertinent because the Moho model, which is used, which is very much a centerpiece of occupational therapists, and the key concept here is volition, that will to power, you know, that what makes us truly human. And I think what we have heard, what I think Dr. Blaine brought in is we've got a model of humanity, which is a top-down model from, you know, the great chain of being, the king, the classes. Some people are more human, better human than others. I think what you're hearing today, a group of people who were former slaves, and how there is something on the inside of them, what makes them human, to break through all those things and to reestablish, reconnect that humanity and make a contribution, a real contribution to the society they find themselves in. Like you find Baroness, Lady Scotland, like you find Bernard Wish and myself. And I think this is a very important area, I believe, of OT to focus on that, what makes people human and the source of their motivation. You know, why do they do things or why don't they do things? What stops them from expanding the occupation, the activities? And I think looking at it from that way, I think brings into OT a very important addition to OT. Very important indeed.
Yep.
Lennox, if you can hear us, your screen is on freeze, but before you leave, I'm assuming that it's nearly midday in Dominica, the sun is shining, etc. Is there anything that you'd like us to take away before you leave, if you're still with us, Lennox Honychurch? Okay, he's on freeze. Any students that are lingering, is there anything you'd like to say before you leave and log off? Because it's so great. When it's great, you don't want to leave. But please, if anyone wants to come on camera quickly and just say something that you've taken away. Remember, we had Emma on Monday. We've had Lennox and Steve here on Thursday. Anyone, please come on camera and say something to be much appreciated. Feel free. Okay.
Blaine, I
So,
just
over to you.
a quick final thought from me that I'm struck by Stephen directing us towards volition in the midst of our occupational justice thinking, and I'm struck by that we might want to interrogate, in inverted commas, Michelle and her volition. We have clues. We have Pan-Africanism. We have her own personal history. She presents as a white woman and yet identifies as a black woman. There's lots of places there. So thank you, Stephen, for reminding me that there's some good interrogation to be done using volition. Yeah, thank you. That's it.